The wind howled across the barren prairie that night, rattling the shutters of the lonely cabin like restless spirits. Inside, the fire burned low, shadows crawling across rough-hewn walls. The rancher sat hunched at his table, a glass of cheap whiskey untouched before him. He was a man carved by loss, his wife taken by fever years ago, his son swallowed by the war, and the land itself sucking more sweat and blood than it ever yielded. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. Then she stepped into his life. The woman was ragged, skin pale from hunger and cold, her moccasins worn through, leaving raw marks on her feet. Her hair was tangled, her lips cracked, but her eyes, those dark, pleading eyes, burned with something fierce, something that even desperation couldn't kill. She didn't belong in this place, not in the middle of nowhere, not in his cabin. Yet there she was, trembling as though every bone in her body threatened to break. She stood by the fire, holding herself, and then, slowly, with hands shaking, she let the shawl slide off her shoulders. It hit the floor with a whisper, and her voice broke in the silence. "I took it off. Please." Her body bore stories carved into flesh, long scars across her back, bruises that hadn't healed, burns that still reddened her skin. She wasn't offering beauty. She was offering surrender, the last weapon of the powerless. The rancher froze. His breath turned to stone in his chest, his fists tightening so hard his knuckles turned white. He had faced down cattle rustlers with guns drawn, had stared into the eyes of men eager to kill, but nothing struck him like this fragile figure standing in front of him. He saw not shame, not filth, but cruelty inflicted by others, a cruelty so raw that it made his gut twist. For a long moment, he didn't move. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and the firelight flickered across his weathered face. He could feel her fear. She expected him to be just another man in a long line who would take what was left of her. And he hated that. He hated it with a fury so hot it burned away the whiskey in his veins. Finally, he rose. His chair screeched against the floorboards as he stood tall, his shadow stretching across her trembling form. She flinched, bracing for pain. Instead, he turned away, reached for the thick wool blanket on his bed, and wrapped it around her shoulders. His hands were rough, but his touch was careful, deliberate, like a man cradling something fragile. "Not like this," he said, his voice a low growl that carried both command and compassion. "Not ever like this." Her knees buckled, and she sank into the chair he had just left, clutching the blanket like it was her last tether to the world. A sob tore out of her throat, raw and jagged, the kind of sound that only comes when someone has carried too much for too long. The rancher stood over her, chest heaving, eyes dark. He felt as though the walls of the cabin had witnessed some sacred vow. Then, like a storm breaking, he turned to the door. His boots pounded across the floor, and he wrenched his old rifle from the rack. The sound of metal sliding into place filled the cabin. He glanced back, his eyes burning with a fire she hadn't expected. "Tell me who did this to you," he demanded, his voice sharp as a whip. "Tell me their names, and I'll see to it they don't live to touch another soul." The woman shook her head, tears blurring her sight. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It's not just one man, it's all of them." Her words hung heavy in the air, heavier than bullets. The rancher's grip on the rifle tightened. If that was true, then his fight had only begun. The woman's confession came out in fits and jagged breaths, pieces of a long story that had no mercy in it. She spoke of a wagon train gone wrong, of men who had turned from traders to predators when law wore thin and whiskey ran thick. She spoke of being seized at night, of being moved from one camp to another, of people who smiled with grease on their lips and hands that never knew a careful touch. The rancher listened, every word a stone dropped into a hollow he'd thought himself too old to feel. He kept his rifle at his side but did not raise it. There was a steadiness in him now that had nothing to do with aim and everything to do with promise. When she named a place, a crooked corral 2 valleys over, his face went ashen with recognition and a slow, ugly anger soaked into his bones. "You should have told someone," he said finally. Not accusing, but trying to find a tether back to rightness. She looked at him then, and something like a little girl reappeared behind the ruined woman. Fear, shame, the belief that no one wanted to hear such tales. "I tried," she whispered. They laughed. "They said a woman like me, who had nothing and was worth less, was asking for trouble. I learned to be quiet." Her hands twisted the blanket, knuckles white. They threatened worse. They said if I screamed, no one would care. The rancher felt bile rise at the memory of what cowardice in a group could do. How men could hide their sins in the shadow of numbers. He planned slowly, not because he was cautious, but because he was honest with the consequences. Revenge drunk on fury made sloppy work. He wanted a way to stop them that would not leave more innocents in the dirt. He thought of the corral she'd named, the way the trader moved his stock, the men who drank in the shade of a particular oak. He listened as she described faces, voices, where the sun cut a corner of the roof, little things that meant the difference between shooting blind and going where the truth broke light. Night would be their ally, he decided. Speed and the dark might be better than a blazing charge. When he spoke of his plan, the voice in him was calm and small, like a man telling a child a bedtime story that had teeth. He would not drag a posse. This was not something to be paraded. He would ride alone, scope the place, learn the guards' routines. Then he would pick the hour when the moon was thin, cut the ropes on the girls he had freed, if any, and smash the smugness of those men in a single clean reckoning. The woman's eyes widened in something like hope, so fragile he wanted to cup it and hold it from the wind. "You can't," she said weakly. "They'll come for you. They'll burn what's left of your place." He shrugged, and the motion was a weary one, not brave so much as resigned to the fact that rightness asked a price. "If they come, they'll find a man who kept his word," he said. "They'll also find a barn with no horse to saddle and a few dogs that'll make trouble." He tried a rough smile that did little to lift the shadow between them. "You get up before dawn and tend the fire. If I don't come back, you run. Don't wait for pity, just run." The woman's laugh was dry but real, a sound like wind under a loose eave. "You think I'll leave you?" she whispered. He shook his head. "I think I'll leave you with a chance." The certainty in him made her look at him differently, no longer solely as a savior, but as a man who would hold others' danger like his own. At dusk he saddled quietly, checking the rifle, the extra rounds tucked in a ragged pouch, a length of rope, 2 flints. The moon rose thin and cold. The rancher's silhouette moved like a ghost over the plain. He paused at the door, hand on the latch, and for a moment his eyes found hers. "Remember," he said, "if you must run, take the path by the creek. It's lower and the dogs can't follow as easy. Above all, live." Riding was slower than he'd expected, with each mile revealing more of the country and the men who made their living on the edges of law. He skirted the main trail, keeping to dry gullies and the dented shadows of the scrub. In the distance, the crooked corral came into view, a place of leaning posts and the stale smell of feed and old beer. Lanterns bobbed like trapped stars. He watched the men, 3 clustered at a fence, 2 inside laughing too loud, 1 asleep half on his saddle. The rancher mapped them in his head, counting, noting the rhythms of tobacco and laughter. He waited until the men had eased into their stupor. When he slipped in behind the fence, the night swallowed him like a second skin. He crept along the shadow of the stalls, rifle low, breath careful. The first shackled door he found opened under his hand with the softest of protests. A tremor ran the boards. He moved like a practiced thing, quick, sure, and merciless to his own fear. Inside, the darkness murmured, shapes hunched, a smell of sweat and stale sorrow. He cut a rope silently, felt a small hand slip into his, the weight of a life so light he nearly wept. A whisper of thanks brushed his cheek in a language he didn't know, but the warmth was the same. They slipped through the corral like ghosts, 2 shadows cradled against his chest. The men began to wake then, the rasp of a chair, the scrape of a boot. It was ugly and immediate, the sound of men realizing a ledger had been upset. A shot cracked the night. A cry rose and the rancher swore under his breath. He ran, taking the straight road he'd mapped, every muscle burning. Bullets whined past, one biting into the post where he'd rested his hand the day before. He felt a hot sting and kept going. Pain was a way to prove he was alive. Back at the ranch, the woman waited by the door, ears catching the first sharp notes of a hawk, heart bunched like a fist. The dogs fidgeted, then stilled, and dust rose beyond the horizon like a promise or a threat. The rancher burst in with the two girls, breathing hard, clothing torn, eyes bright with the fire of a man who had pushed himself past what he thought possible. She clung to him as if to a rock in a river, shaking, the life in her returning in ragged, thankful sobs. He sank to his knees, hand pressed to the wound that bled warm on his side, and for the first time since he'd shouldered his rifle, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he'd done.